Welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Podcast with your host, Katie Miranda. You can support this podcast by subscribing to Katie's Patreon at patreon.com/Katie Miranda or by visiting Katie's online jewelry and art store at katiemiranda.com. PalBox is a non-profit subscription box supporting Palestinian farmers, artisans, and the international solidarity movement. You can subscribe at palbox.org. All of these links can be found in the description of each episode.
Hi, I'm Katie Miranda. Welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Podcast. Today I'm here with Lubna Abu-Osba. She's a designer, and we're going to talk today about Palestinian tahtreez and her business that she's created behind that. So Lubna, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your business, Lubna Palestine?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a designer, and I've been in love and really inspired by Palestinian embroidery since I was a kid. And both of my grandmothers and my mother and my aunts were really passionate about Palestinian embroidery as well. And in fact, my grandmothers did their own embroidery, and so did my great aunts. And one of my aunts, who was, in fact, supported her family through Palestinian embroidery, she was really instrumental in solidifying my love for the craft and actually really helped me get my first line off the ground and connected me to these amazing embroideresses who are from my village outside of Jaffa. So it was really cool to kind of have people that I was, connected to in terms of my heritage in Palestine, previous to the Nakba, to be involved in this, because it was really important to me to have it be really authentic to the history of how it was made versus just doing. Now, these days, we see a lot of machine embroidery, which to me really takes away from the beauty and the history of how and why these garments were made. But I always was a little bit not thrilled with the silhouettes of the dresses, which were always the same and kind of shapeless. And so when I was a kid, I always thought, one day I'm going to become a designer and I'm going to create modern silhouettes, but with traditional embroidery, and perhaps also create original embroidery instead of doing the traditional motifs that you see all over everything. Because in some ways I feel like, not as a criticism, but Palestinian culture has kind of been is sort of a capsule in time of what we were before 1948 and even before 1967. And I really wanted to see the craft evolve into something modern, as if nothing had ever happened and we were still in Palestine, and the historical events were not relevant. And so I think that the history of tahtreez really kind of reemerged in 1967, because a lot of women, even my grandmother included, were wearing Western dress. And after 1967, as a way to really assert Palestinian identity, they started to wear traditional dress again, to say, we have a unique Palestinian identity that is separate from the Lebanese, from the Syrians, that we're not this monolithic culture, and that we are indeed a distinct culture with a distinct traditions and a distinct identity. And so kind of from that point of view, they really wanted to show the historical aspect of traditional dress. But my thinking was, how can we evolve that into a modern context, and also give women in the diaspora who are younger and less traditional to be able to show their identity in a way that is not um, constrained by tradition, so that it's clothing that they could wear to work, to school, and then have it not only just be a point of pride, but also an entry point of discussion into what it is, why they're wearing it, um, and kind of begin a conversation about Palestinians. And did accessories. I did shoes, scarves, and handbags. And the irony was, when I launched the line, it was right after 9/11. So it
Was
wasn't
that a
really.
good time to launch the line, or did that kind of hurt you, the time?
Well, I think that it created a lot of anxiety on my part. It was twofold. Like, it was funny because one of the first stores to carry my line was actually a Palestinian shoe store in New York City. And he had been targeted by people right after the attacks, where people were throwing things at his store. Sorry, it's just, I'm a New Yorker, so that time was
No worries.
really difficult. And so he wanted to show the beauty of Palestinians, of Arab culture, and that it's not this being painted by the brush of terrorist acts. But we didn't really come out and say that it was Palestinian embroidery or that it was made by Palestinian women. It was kind of this inferred that if you were in the know, you would know that. And if you didn't know, then it was just this beautiful object or garment that you could enjoy. And I think that I kind of shied away from being really explicit in it being Palestinian, and I kind of just said it was Eastern Mediterranean, right? Which becomes like code for so many restaurants and designers.
Right.
And this time around, when I relaunched the line, I was really, I wanted to be really unapologetic about what it was, which is why I put the name Palestine in the brand.
Yeah,
That
because your URL is lubnapalestine.com.
Right. And the name of the line is Lubna Palestine, because just like Prada is from Italy, or Gucci is from Italy, and Louis Vuitton is French, and you can't separate those countries from those
Right.
products. I wanted to do the same thing with this brand. I wanted people to understand and know that this was a Palestinian inspired heritage brand, and to have no confusion about that. And I didn't want anyone to be mistaken about what it was, because it really is so distinctive and is so specific to Palestine and to Palestinians. And I think that I was more concerned about Palestinian women than I was about the general public. I wanted to create something that Palestinian women could be really proud of, and feel their connection to their heritage through their clothing. And it was funny because there was something that Anna Wintour said in an interview, where they asked her, is fashion art? And she said, no, fashion is not art. It's artful, but fashion is political. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, because I think fashion indeed is political, because it has to do with identity politics, and it's a way to assert who you are, and your culture. And we've seen that, with African Americans and Native Americans, and oftentimes actually oppressed groups. So I wanted to be able to give Palestinian women clothing and a brand that they could feel a lot of pride in, and that also reflected their modern lifestyle.
That's wonderful. I love tahtreez myself, and I've noticed that the dresses are, as you said, they are a little bit shapeless. So I actually found you on Instagram where you've been posting a lot of like your previous products from when you first launched, and they're just absolutely beautiful. Is your target customer, are they only Palestinian women, or do you want other people to wear your products as well?
I mean, I definitely want it to be inclusive. Um, and I want to introduce other women to the beauty of Palestinian culture and Palestinian traditions in a modern way that is accessible. Because, of course, Palestinian women will wear traditional thobes, even if they wear more modern garments. But I wanted to make it more accessible to everybody in their everyday life, and not just during, a cultural festival or a wedding or a special occasion. I wanted it to really be integrated into their everyday life, whether it's a purse or whether it's a belt or whether it's a dress or a jacket, so that it doesn't have to be saved for these moments where you're just within your own company of other Palestinians.
Right.
Um, I wanted it to be almost the garments to be an ambassador to Palestinian culture. Um, and I definitely want a larger audience of women to be exposed to it and discover it and find relevance to it. Because another kind of overarching trend that's happening is this idea of slow fashion.
What's that?
And so slow fashion is clothing that is not made by, underpaid garment workers in a far off land, that's done very cheaply with, dyes that are really bad for the environment and fabrics that have, consumed tremendous amounts of water and has put a lot of chemicals in the process of being, and pesticides in the process of being created, so that it's created fast and it's created cheaply, and then it's disposed of. So with slow fashion, it's, who made your garment, and it's made by a person, not a machine. And it's constructed with a sense of craftsmanship and artistry and an artisanal tradition. So it's kind of like the difference between an artisanal goat cheese and like Velveeta.
Okay.
So, um, and by doing that, you're really crafting something that can last for a really, really long time, as well, so that it has a more sustainable, less of a environmental impact as well, which is a big trend right now also in fashion, which is how can we make our garments more sustainable and have less of a carbon footprint. So being made locally, being made by hand, being fair trade, so that the person who's actually making it is being paid a fair wage for this beautiful thing that they're making. Because often these garment workers are exploited, and are in really bad working conditions on top of not being paid a fair wage. So those are the tenets, more or less, of slow fashion and sustainable fashion.
And so you said you launched right after 9/11, and you were in business for a while. I saw your products were in various fashion magazines like Glamour and who else?
I got a really great response from editors. So it was picked up by Glamour and Mary Claire and New York Magazine and Las Vegas Magazine and Grace Magazine. And it was interesting, actually, because I was producing the shoes in Beirut shortly after 9/11. And then I continued to do it into the invasion of the Iraq War. So there were all these major political situations that were happening in the midst of trying to create this Middle Eastern line that was made in the Middle East. And what happened was it was just creating a lot of friction in terms of my production because things weren't getting imported properly because of the war with Iraq. So even though I was in Beirut, it was stopping certain shipments from coming from different places. You know, importing into the States from Lebanon also created a whole nother level of complexity where the US was really holding up a lot of shipments that were coming from the Middle East, whether it was from Morocco or, you know, it didn't matter, like that it wasn't directly involved with Iraq. So there was kind of that going on in the background, but then in the meanwhile, these editors were really embracing the line because they saw that there was a lot of misinformation about the Middle East and Middle Eastern designers. And so they were trying to kind of break these stereotypes. And at the time, the International Herald Tribune actually did a story on me called Putting Lebanon's Best Foot Forward, because they just couldn't believe that after 9/11, this Palestinian designer from New York had showed up on their shores and was like, I'm going to make shoes for the world and everyone's going to love them because they're beautiful. So it was great that I had that naivety of youth. But ultimately, you know, when car bombs are going off on your way to a factory and you're losing electricity because the Israelis are bombing electric generators, it just made it really, really difficult to continue.
So you stopped for a while?
So I stopped
because of
for
those
a while
problems?
Because it was just becoming dangerous, especially with the car bombings and the flyovers, and those bombings as well. So I took a break, and I always knew I would come back to it. And then I kind of realized there was never going to really be a good time in some ways to be an Arab, to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I'm laughing about that. I mean, because it's kind of ridiculous, but and I just thought, you know what? I just don't care about the politics. It's like, I can't let that, I mean, people are doing really, really important work, like really important humanitarian work and medical, whether they're, you know, doctors or they're activists. And so I felt like, you know, what I was doing wasn't that, if they had the courage to do it, I certainly could muster the courage to do it as well. And to be really unapologetically Palestinian about it, because I always felt, and I've always felt this way, I never felt like I should have to apologize for who I am. You know, I've certainly never done anything to hurt anyone. And my identity is my identity. It's what I was born Palestinian. So that always seemed controversial and really strange to me, that it would be something that's controversial.
I've heard that from a lot of Palestinians, this kind of question or concern that they shouldn't have to apologize for being Palestinian. And it's such a strange thing to think about, because it's like, of course you shouldn't have to apologize for who you are, but you know, that burden falls disproportionately on Palestinians, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're always kind of in this position where you feel like you need to defend your identity, defend your right to exist, and to kind of take it out of a political arena. Because what people always want to do is they want to debate with me about Yasser Arafat or Hamas. And I'm like,
I just want to make some shoes.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, I didn't vote for these people. And to my knowledge, not a lot of people have. So, that is all immaterial to people getting to live in dignity and in peace. And that, historical circumstances don't erase who I am. And it's funny because a couple of weeks ago, I had posted various, I had these vintage postcards from the 1960s of tradition. They were actually Christmas cards, and they depicted various regional dress throughout Palestine. So the Galilee, Nazareth, Bethlehem. And I got this troll comment which said, "Oh, see, you guys don't really exist as a national identity. Even the people dress differently throughout the regions of Palestine." And I'm like, well, throughout the regions of France, they also dress differently. And throughout the regions of, Ireland, they dress differently. And I just found it so absurd and so petty that they would find that as evidence that the Palestinian identity doesn't exist. Meanwhile, with tahtreez, the thing that's so interesting about it is that the different regions do have different motifs based on really their environment. So in the desert areas, they tend to have they tend to have black. It's always black, which in a way doesn't make sense to me in the desert, but they tend to use those colors, black and red. And then, if they're fallahin, if they're farmers, they would have a lot of motifs that showed wheat and palms and oranges and things like that. And then, in Bethlehem, they would have crosses that were, embroidered into their tahtreez. And then there was even, there's even other motifs that come during the Mandate period with lions, where they had lion motifs because I think these women just it wasn't that they were condoning the British occupation, of course, but it was, they just kind of took their inspiration from everywhere. And also the snake, that was something that you would see a lot in fallahin embroidery, because the snakes were actually a pest, but they liked the look of it. So it was, part of the motifs. So it's interesting to just see what the variations of them are and what the meaning is behind them. And then sometimes there really isn't a tremendous amount of meaning. It's just something that's aesthetic, that was pleasing to the woman who embroidered that garment.
And so are you using these traditional motifs, or are you creating new ones?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm actually really focusing on two types of embroidery design. One, which is the more traditional motifs, but specifically from thobs that are in my family. So my grandmothers, my great aunts, my aunt, my mother, and the thobs that they did. So I'm taking those motifs, my sort of ancestral motifs, and incorporating those into new placements, but the design of the actual stitches are pretty accurate. And I guess that's, for me, kind of keeping that lineage alive and sort of keeping their legacy alive.
And who are the women who are doing the embroidery? Are they in Lebanon or are they in Palestine?
They're both in Ramallah and in Jordan. So the women that are in Jordan are actually a group of sisters who are from my same village in Jaffa. And, they've been displaced and live in Jordan now. But they grew up embroidering, and they're amazing. And they have this amazing sort of bank of like a repository of designs, and I've in the last 20 years that I've been working with them, they've also really educated me to what the various motifs are and where they came from, and what they mean, um, and they're really, they're artists is how I see them. It's just their palette is thread and their canvas is fabric. Um, so it's been a really great collaboration with them. So a lot of the traditional stuff, like I said, is inspired by women in my own family, and also what this group of embroiderists also bring, because their knowledge is so deep. And then I'm just doing completely new designs using that cross stitch, and then incorporating some traditional aspects, but making them much more graphic, much more modern, much more bold. Because I just feel like it needs to evolve, and it would have evolved had we hadn't been put on pause. Because in some ways the culture's been put on pause, and we're so what's the word, like, not distracted, but we're so engulfed in the politics of the region, and people are also just so engulfed by just the daily challenges of life, like whether it's getting your kids to school, which could be treacherous, or getting to the hospital, and all these types of things that culture and art kind of fall to the wayside. But what I'm seeing, especially with Palestinians in the diaspora, because they're not, they don't have this, they're not living under this horrible occupation and this pressure of daily life and trying to get through your daily life. They've been creating a lot of very modern interpretations of traditional Palestinian design vernacular, if that makes sense. So they're taking like the keffiyeh, they're putting it on ties and socks. They're, doing T-shirts that are like, hoodies, and just really kind of inventive, modern things. And I'm seeing that also as well with the younger generation in the West Bank too. They're really kind of taking the culture, the design culture, in a new modern direction, because a teenager is going to more likely want to wear a hoodie than they will want to wear a tob or an egal, or things that their grandfather would have worn.
Right. And another reason perhaps the culture sort of was paused, and I think that's changing with Palestinian American designers like yourself. It's so hard to get products out of Palestine, and even to sell them online. And I've had a lot of experience with this myself, because I import crafts from Palestine to sell in my nonprofit subscription box, Pal Box. And it's so challenging. And a lot of these producers and artisans, it's like they can't just set up an Etsy store like the rest of us can, due to the restrictions with the banks and PayPal and shipping and all this kind of stuff. And I really noticed this when I first started selling on Etsy back in like 2009 or 2010. There are all these Israeli designers, but there's no Palestinian designers. And it's like, well, why is that? They can't.
I mean, it's people ask me, oh, the embroidery is so beautiful, why is it on this terrible fabric? And I'm like, because they can't get it. They can't get better fabrics. They just have what's there, and trying to import things is very difficult in and out of there. And they'll just, hold things up because they can.
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience with that too. Things getting just
and I
held
think
up for no
sometimes,
reason.
yeah, because, there is a culture war going on as well. I mean, beyond just the occupation, whether it's with, there's a culture war going on with Palestinian food. Is it, we used to call it the falafel wars. Like, is it Israeli? Is it Palestinian? On like these international school nights, the Palestinian mom wants to bring falafel, and then there's an Israeli mom wants to bring falafel, and then it just turns into this whole kooky thing that doesn't really make a lot of sense at the end of the day. But again, it really comes down to identity and these identity politics, which become really politicized. And I just feel like at the most sort of simple way to say it is that it's this beautiful garment that needs to be out in the world and appreciated. And the origins of it need to be known and appreciated, because this was created by Palestinians. This is the history of Palestinians. This is the artistry of Palestinians. And we are more than just a war and occupation and suicide bombings and, all the kind of negative stereotypes that people in the press want to impose on us. And I think you can either, get angry about it and feel victimized by it, or in some ways kind of just ignore it and just do your thing, whether that's music or it's doing really great, graffiti or calligraphy, or it's making hoodies, or it's writing a cookbook. There's been some really excellent things done by, like Judy Kalla and Reem Kassis, and these beautiful, beautiful cookbooks that just in of itself existing is a political statement, even though it shouldn't have to be.
Right.
But it is. And it's kind of, when you're Palestinian, it's really hard to separate yourself from the politics. It's kind of all swirled in the same DNA. So I kind of just come from this perspective of not ignoring it, but just saying, I'm not going to even acknowledge that who I am is controversial. Even though at the start of this conversation, I was saying it is controversial, but I'm like, everyone else can assert their own identity and their heritage without it turning into a whole thing. I mean, Ralph Lauren built his entire business around American heritage, whether it was like Gary Cooper or Audrey Hepburn or, Native Americans, which he kind of got in trouble for. But, the whole WASP aesthetic, there's some Brooks Brothers, Lilly Pulitzer, Kate Spade, all of these brands are heritage brands that are based on American culture, which has a lot of different influences. So I just felt like the Palestinians needed that as well. Like, we needed a brand that really encompassed our entire culture and the beauty of our culture that was separate from politics.
And you're going to be launching soon, right? When can people start to buy your products?
Oh, that's like my $1 million question. So I'm hoping by the end of the year. That's the goal. And they're going to be, I really want to be able to keep the artisanal quality and just the quality in general really high. And there's been, there are other Palestinian designers who are doing things that are inspired by Palestinian embroidery, but whether it's printed, sometimes it's like it's a pattern that's based on it, but it's printed, it's not embroidered, or it's machine embroidered. And for me, like, the hand of the Palestinian woman is so intrinsic to these designs, um, that they're all going to be made to order. So there'll be a wait time, and I'm hoping that people will have the patience to wait for it to be made, especially for them, which is traditionally how it was always done. You would commission a dress, and then you would wait for that embroideress to finish embroidering it for you, and then it would be constructed. And then, because I want these to feel really personalized, they will be limited editions. So there'll be limited quantities for each style. So women will come away really feeling like it's a special heirloom piece that was made just for them.
And we are going to do a giveaway now. Lubna has generously agreed to give away a free scarf. I'm going to tell you how you can get that scarf. If you go to palbox.org and subscribe to receive a PAL box, and you type in Lubna as the coupon code, the first person who does that, Lubna will send you a complimentary scarf, a hand embroidered scarf. So you can get that at palbox.org. And thank you, Lubna, for that very generous offer to our listeners.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I want to spread the love.
And how can people follow you on Instagram?
They can follow at Lubna Palestine, and that'll also be the URL, lubnapalestine.com. So check back in around Christmas time. And in the meantime, you can get a lot of sneak peeks and behind the scenes and our works in progress on Instagram.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, Lubna, and best of luck for your product launch.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.